20 people, one question. What advice do you give your future self?
Advice to give my future self. I'd probably stop caring about what people think about me and don't give a crap about their feelings.
Your future self.
You know what? Don't do steroids.
What advice would you give your future self?
To laugh more and worry less.
What advice do you give your future self?
To get a lot of girls.
What advice would you give your future self?
Don't smoke crack.
What advice would you give your future self?
Fucking take steroids!
Give your future self.
I think I'd tell my future self I should keep myself busy, take up a hobby, like fencing or something. I like to fence, do that sort of thing. Maybe I'd like to live in a castle also. I want to tell my future self to live in a castle, because if I find in the future that I'm not living in a castle, I'm really going to regret it, I think. That's it.
Give your future self.
To not drown in soap again.
What advice would you give your future self?
Just enjoy life.
What advice would you give your future self?
Okay, I give my future self the advice to marry a rich hot guy, and then have a couple of kids, be successful, be a good wife, and just have a good time. That's about
What
it.
advice do you give your future self?
Be your own boss. I thought he was here in the group. I would, my future self, to go for a better job and become extremely successful and find Matt and kill him.
I tell myself to just be a little more like Barack Obama.
What advice would you give your future self?
I'd work my hardest to be as successful as Bob Bell Bowie.
What advice would you give your future self?
Don't eat hummus at parties.
What advice would you give your future self?
Well, that's sort of akin to saying if you could do it all over again. The advice that I would give my future self is to be more serious about myself in my academic work. I really was a lot smarter than I gave myself credit for being, and so I sloughed things off and didn't work as hard as I should. It's a real mistake. I regret it now. And if I could, I'd correct it.
What advice would you give your future self?
I would continue to live my life the way I have been. I'm very happy, very successful, and I think I would continue status quo, just the way things have been for me.
What advice would you give your future self?
Don't mess with Dirty Mike and the boys.
What advice would you give your future self?
Stay strong. And
What advice would you give your future self?
Well, since I'm looking forward to retirement the year after next school year, I would say relax and enjoy.
What advice would you give your future self?
Well, a wise man once told me that if I ride the Pound Town Express all the way to class, I'll be fine.
What advice would you give your future self?
I would tell my future self to get paid.
What advice would you give your future self?
I need to tell myself anything. I'm 30 years old.
What advice would you give your future self?
I would tell my future self to, oh my gosh, I would tell my future self to stick to my convictions, and that even though youth is fleeting, I can still keep my mentality towards life and my vivaciousness, and despite my failures, success is a subjective entity.
What advice would you give your future self?
If I could give my future self some advice, probably be not to become a dad at such a young age.
What advice would you give your future self?
I would tell my future self to always follow your dreams, but in doing so, you've got to follow them quickly, because otherwise you won't be able to follow your new dreams.
What advice would you give your future self?
To work hard and never give up.
What advice would you give your future self?
I don't really know what to say. I don't know. I'll think about it.
What advice would you give yourself for the future?
Well, I just want to say I'm just going to marry either Isabella or Olivia Passy, and we're just going to get married and have like a few kids, you know, we're going to have a big house, we're going to have a lot of money, you know. Thanks, good enough with me. That's my future.
What advice would you give your future self?
Well, when I'm not this many, I'll give myself like grow up and be a big boy and like have a couple kids and just have a lot of fun and get a big house and feed all my kids.
What advice would you give your future self?
Probably do a lot of cocaine, take your pants off, set your house on fire.